Welcome to episode 6 of the Belief Books podcast. This is Josh Naiman, and for this series, I'm meeting with some amazing people, documenting those conversations and digging a little deeper into what's going on in this world and trying to figure out what people believe and why. So for this episode, I drove up to beautiful Traverse City, Michigan to interview 5 experts on climate change and denial last April. If you've listened to episode 1 already, you met Peter Sinclair from that tour. If you haven't listened to that episode, it's a good primer for many things climate change and climate change denier related. I suggest you listen to any of the 5 other episodes I've published if you haven't already. Anyway, in this episode, you'll meet my guest from the 4th interview I did on that 2-day tour through Michigan.
And so I feel like this conversation between me and you is a way that maybe I just need to think a little bit differently and get a little more active and proactive about what I know and what I don't know and what else is out there.
That's Nikki Rothwell, horticulturalist, Michigan State University Extension Specialist, and Northwest Michigan Horticulture Research Center Coordinator. I've got to say that this conversation was a pleasure and really educational for me. We talk about the work she does with horticulture and how it's affected by climate change, her close relationships with growers and why that's so important. There's a bathtub scene, fair warning. We get into what she does to combat climate change on her own and with the organizations she works with. But then we dive deeper. We get into a deeper discussion about the root of the problem with denial and really dig into the value of having difficult conversations. You'll hear the word conversations a lot. And if you want to start a drinking game, drink or take a sip every time you hear the word conversation. Anyways, Nikki really reflects on her work and her family life towards the end of this episode. We get into time and being busy and how these widely accepted norms that culture and society have accepted affect how we address the big issues that face us. So I think this is a really valuable conversation. There you go. Drink one. You'll also hear her mention the event the night before where she was a speaker on a Citizens Climate Lobby panel that I attended. Lucky timing for me, but I wanted to let you know about that ahead of time. In this interview, I learned so much about yet another area of humanity affected by climate change and met yet another amazing person on this fantastic quest that is the Belief Books.
So I grew up on a beef cattle farm. So my dad was a teacher, but we also farmed as well. And it was about probably 45 minutes south of here. And so I was looking for a summer job that was related to agriculture, and I didn't have a background because we had, beef cattle. So I was looking for something more in the plant sciences. So I was a biology and chemistry major, and so I was really looking to do something in agriculture because I really liked it. So I worked here when I was 21, and I was a research summer tech, and I did lots of different things. And the thing that I loved about it most was the interaction with growers. So that's what really sold extension and research, because you're basically, doing this research and then you turn around and you extend it back out to the growers. And so I felt like that was a really unique concept. I'm housed at a remote research station, so we're 3.5 hours from the main campus at MSU. So we're kind of that first stop for growers. This is where they come for research. This is where they come for extension. This is where they come for any problem that they have. And then if we can't answer it, we depend on our colleagues on campus and we collaborate to deliver the information that they need. And so the thing about this research station is it's a two-way street. It's not me always giving these guys information. They're also like, well, Nikki, do you know about this? Or Nikki, is this on your radar? So I also can work with colleagues on campus to say, hey, that research really isn't applicable. That's really not our top priority. I'm living and working in, like I said, the heart of cherry country. So I feel like I have a pretty good handle on what growers need. And so I think it's really valuable, and the land grant system was brilliant when they designed it, is because they put people in communities or in regions or areas to deal with real issues. And so sometimes I feel like when you're 3.5 hours from the community you're dealing with, maybe you might miss some of that. And so I feel like it's created a really tight-knit relationship with our industry, extension and field research, and then our colleagues on campus. And so I feel like we're really blessed in Michigan to have such a tight-knit group, and I think that the fruit team in Michigan and our industries are working tremendously well together.
Yeah, from what I've experienced, that's exactly the case. And it just seems like a no-brainer that you would put the people who are doing the research right in the area and the proximity of where the people are doing the work.
And it's funny, the joke is that I actually gave advice in the bathtub once, because I also live here too. And so I had a grower that was yelling from my front door, and I was like, Francis. And he's like, I just have a question. He asked me the question, and I just yelled back. And so you just have this really intimate relationship in that you're accessible, like even at weird times. And so you're accessible, and it makes you accountable. And it also makes you really realize, growers or farmers or everyone, they need help, and they need answers sometimes right now. And so that's why it's so awesome that they have these field research stations and that you're placed in these different areas that you can respond really quickly.
Yeah, it just makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. So what's your day-to-day?
That's the other thing I like about the shop. It's different every day. So I'm not, I like to come to work, and, the other thing is there's always new challenges on the horizon. And so I think that's really nice too, that you're always responding to different things. So it's not the same old every day. So today we're hosting Senator Stabenow's Ag Staff. So Senator Stabenow is our state senator here in Michigan, and she was the chairwoman of the Senate Ag Committee when the Democrats were in charge of the show. But now she's still involved, and she's been the champion for the Farm Bill for the last 2 go-rounds. And so she is also, still a major part of that today. And so she's sending her ag staff here. And so we were responsible, on my extension hat, is to gather, different farmers, different growers together in the fruit growing community to say, hey, what's important to you guys for this next Farm Bill? And so we've tapped into our new farmers, we've tapped into some of our veteran farmers, and they'll come here today, and we'll spend an hour and a half doing a round table of some of the major things that our growers think is important. And the thing is about Senator Stabenow is that she's really listened. And so at the talk last night, Brandon Fewens, her rep from up here, when we had the crop disaster because of the spring frost in 2012, we were like, oh my gosh, we need some policy change, we need some policy help. And so Senator Stabenow was really the person that really made a tart cherry insurance program, crop insurance program work. So when we lost the crop in 2012, there was nothing growers could do about it. So they didn't even have the option to buy insurance. So we have insurance programs for lots of different crops, apples, we have a pilot program for sweet cherries, but tart cherry growers had no option to buy insurance. And so when we talk about issues about climate change, sometimes there are policy related issues and how we can help them, mitigate that risk. And one of those was to come up with insurance. So if you start to have these events where we're getting crop losses in once every decade, is it worth it for your farm to take out that insurance? And growers make that decision themselves. So if they want to take out insurance, they can. But at least Senator Stabenow had the vision to say, at least we have that option.
Yeah, that also makes sense.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, and it's funny when you talk about insurance, you rarely would buy a house and not get homeowners insurance. You wouldn't drive a car without car insurance. So sometimes, especially, I feel like these insurance programs have become more important with weird weather, unpredictable weather. We've had 2 hailstorms in the last 2 years. And so these hailstorms have really devastated some farms. And so it's a way to ensure that you're going to be able to pay your bills, that you're going to have your farm in the future. It just gives you another tool in that toolbox when you see things or when things come your way that you couldn't have predicted.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I talked to Jim. He told me about the branch that he gave you, and I saw it in your office today.
Yeah. So, and that hail is from 2 years ago. So and that's the other thing about perennial cropping systems that's somewhat different than those that, grow corn and soybeans and wheat. I mean, they change that every year. It's an annual crop. We invest for 30 years in our trees. And so if you have a hailstorm that happened 2 years ago and you're still seeing some of that, we have a disease that can still come in on some of those wounds on the trees 2 years later. I mean, you got to keep your trees healthy. So you got to keep them healthy for next year and the year after that. What's different about these perennial crops is that it's about this year. So in corn, if you get X amount of bushel per acre, you're pretty excited. And bushels fluctuate year to year depending on rainfall and drought. But in our situation, our crops fluctuate year to year, but then you have to keep those trees healthy so you get the crop year in and year out. And so I feel like sometimes that's an added challenge for those growers that grow those perennial crops. They just have to make sure that the tree is healthy to get the crop, even if they lost the crop in 2012. So you still got to mow, you still got to maintain your nutrition programs or whatever you would do annually, even if you had no crop. And that in 2012 was really hard for growers to swallow.
So what happened in 2012? What's the issue? What's the problem?
Yeah, 2012 was really strange because I remember we were blooming in sweet cherries at the end of March. We typically bloom the 1st of May. So what happens is we had a really mild winter and then it was followed by these crazy abnormal warm-ups in March. I mean, we were hitting 80 degrees for 7 days. And it was weird because my parents were like, they're snowbirds, and it was warmer in Michigan than it was in Florida. And I remember thinking, every Michigander is like, oh, it's spring, it's warm, it's sunny, we're so excited. And you remember thinking, this is so warm, but this is so bad. Because you knew nothing was good was going to come of it. So we always have challenges in the spring with spring frost. Usually that window of like nail biting is about 4 weeks. So buds start to push like this time of year, so April, and we have about 4 weeks till the first week of May, the second week of May before we bloom. And then hopefully we escape that without, frost events or freeze events. So it's a 4-week window. But if you start pushing and blooming at the end of March, you now have an 8-week window where you're never gonna get a frost or freeze event in northern Michigan. It's unheard of. And that year we had 22 freeze events. So 22 freeze events, and so they came one after the other, and they just slowly ticked away at the crop. And so it was the cherry crop, it was the apple crop, it was the juice grapes, blueberries. I mean, so Michigan that grows all these crops really well, and we're in the top 5 in a lot of those in that production. We had nothing. And that is a huge blow to our economy in the state. I mean, Michigan's economy, I think we rival the auto industry. We're number 2, and we're really crouching on the auto industry. And the Senator Stabenow always likes to tell this. When she became the chair of the Senate Ag, they're like, you're from Michigan. You're like, you do cars. But people forget that Michigan's has the most diverse amount of crops after California. Yeah, so it's very unique. And so when she became the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, they're just like, you're a car lady. And she's like, no way. We have a ton of crops in Michigan. So it puts us in a unique position, I think, in the state, in the country.
So what do you guys do or you personally or your organization, what do you do to directly try to combat climate change? What can you do? What can one organization or one person do?
I mean, it's a good question, and I think, it's a question I think that researchers and extension folks really needed to be asking 15 years, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I feel like we've started having these more open discussions with growers or within the scientific community, especially the extension part of it, only in the last 5 or 10 years. And so I feel like we probably should have been at the forefront. But I feel like some of the things that we're doing directly is, I mentioned last night, we do have a tart cherry breeder. And so but what's really interesting, her breeding was really about a disease resistance program. We have a fungal pathogen called cherry leaf spot that really drives our spray programs, because if you lose your leaves too early, your trees defoliate. What happens is they can't ripen a crop, and then more importantly, they don't store enough carbohydrates to overwinter. And so during a harsh winter, your trees can be killed if they defoliate too early. So we have to use fungicides. And growers wanted to move away from fungicides, so the primary goal of her breeding program was resistance to cherry leaf spot. 2002, we lost the crop. 2012, we lost the crop. A lot of her breeding program has focused on a more like a cherry that blooms later, or a cherry that's more resistant to spring frosts or things like that. And so that's one of her goals of her program, is to try to get through these spring frost freeze events. And as I mentioned, that's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. This is a long-term effort for Dr. Iazzoni. So some of the things we're doing on the short term is we're working with sprinkler systems. So a lot of times you can put sprinklers under trees and it raises the temperature just enough that you might get through a frost event. We've been using, more and more growers have been investing in frost fans, so it keeps air moving. In a true inversion frost, the cold air sinks to the bottom, and so you can freeze out, but if you have a frost fan, it'll keep that air moving and you won't have that inversion layer. It's really interesting, sometimes in the spring when we're in bloom, I can drive to work and I can see where that inversion layer is, because half the bottom of the trees, or the bottom half or whatever, are brown. All the petals on the blooms are brown, and then above it's white. And so growers are really investing in frost fans, and we have new towers that try to help growers predict when they're going to have an inversion frost. So we're trying to do that through new technology. We're working, as I mentioned last night, on a program that climate change predictions, they're predicting warmer and wetter. So if it's warmer and wetter, you're creating a nice little petri dish for a lot of diseases. So we have a graduate student that's manipulating, relative humidity and temperature, and seeing if our climate predictions are going to give you warmer and wetter, and how that's going to affect growers' management programs. And then the other thing that we're really concentrating on right now is an invasive insect pest, and I'm sure Jim mentioned it to you, is the spotted winged Drosophila. That has been a main thrust of our focus. So I was talking to our technicians out there. It's, they're trying to come up with sites to do a lot of research. We're trying to decide how many students we need to hire to actually get this research done. And so we have a lot of different funding sources, federal, state, and commodity grants that are really focused on trying to solve this key issue. It's been called an industry killer. So it's an invasive pest from Asia. And the thing is that I think it's really related to climate is because it's a Drosophilid. So it's the same genus as you would do genetic stuff, trials on, even in undergrad. They're the little fruit flies with red eyes. And the thing that's so interesting about them, why we do genetic testing, is because they can crank through generations. So you can see mutations quicker. But the problem is, in the real world situation, they crank through so many generations that their populations basically build exponentially. So you could start with very few at the beginning of the season, and by August, we're catching thousands in a trap. And our traps are ridiculously ineffective. So, there's just billions out there. We've played with some numbers sometimes. So one of the things I'm trying to do in a research project this year is modify the landscape. So our tart cherries right now are grown on standard rootstocks. So the rootstock's the bottom half of the tree, and then the scion or the cultivar is the top. And the rootstock usually determines the size of the tree. Our rootstocks are still growing really big trees. We also basically have sod row centers to prevent erosion. And so what we're doing is we have these big canopies, we have this nice lush grass. I think we're creating a really conducive area for spotted winged Drosophila. So we're trying to modify that landscape. Can we put wood chips down? Can we put weed fabric down? Can we do some more intensive pruning and open up those trees so they don't want to stay in those trees, that they would move back and forth? So that's one of the things that we're really interested in. And so when I take that back to climate change and how quickly that they can develop, what I see, or what my concerns are, if we're warmer and wetter, are we just going to go from 3 generations per season to 5 or 6? And we've seen that. Every year we've caught the first flies earlier and earlier, since 2010 when we caught our first ones in Michigan. And every year the population explodes early and earlier. So when we started collecting spotted wing, or SWD we call it, we thought, we'll be done with tart cherry harvest in Northwest Michigan. We don't have to worry about it, because the populations weren't exploding until September. Then they started growing in August. Now they're growing in July really quickly, and now they're overlapping with tart cherry harvest. And so growers are really behind the 8 ball with this pest and trying to control it. So we're working on more bigger pictures, so landscape size, stepping back. And so it's not just we're always spraying. Is there something we can do to modify our orchard systems to make it less conducive or less attractive? And this is only a little snippet of what we're doing. We have a huge nationwide project that's funded by USDA, Specialty Crop Research Initiative. So there's lots and lots of entomologists out in the country working on it. And this pest is in Europe. So the estimated damages from Italy last year is that it basically destroyed what they think is 50% of the crops that are affected by SWD. They lost 50% of the crop to this pest. So this is this is on everybody's radar. And so again, as climate changes and if it warms, are we going to be dealing with, more generations of this pest? But what's the next pest? What's the next disease that we didn't see on the radar that we're, as we're moving things all around the world all the time? And so these are things I think that is really going to play into climate change in trying to I think we had a handle on some of the old things. And now we're dealing with more intensive storms, weather events, all those kinds of things. And then on top of that, you add invasive species to that. I think this is it's a real challenge, I think, for all industries, not just even tart cherries.
Yeah, it's fascinating and kind of scary that just this one little thing, literally a very, very small thing, is a huge, huge deal. And that's just one of the huge factors that go into this issue that affect the things going on.
It's really interesting that it is one little fly, but I can't believe the impact it's had. The other thing that we've really seen, nothing brings people together like a crisis. And we've always been relevant, I think. I feel like because we're in that community we live in, I feel like we've always been relevant. I feel like we're more relevant than we've ever been before. And I think it's more critical to have continued communication between industry, growers, campus researchers across the world, that kind of thing. And then the thing that is also more critical that I think I said last night is that we've got to continue with funding. And so, the whole scare of, is that good science? Is that bad science? In my opinion, as a scientist, science is science. You run a science experiment, you set up, you test a hypothesis, and the answer you get is yes or no. This is what happened. This is true. Your hypothesis is true, or it's not. So I feel like this whole idea of we have good and bad science is actually hugely detrimental. And so my concern is if there is that mentality, and if our new administration really believes in good and bad science, I worry about the funding streams, the dedication, the commitment to figure out long-term strategies to these problems, as well as how are growers going to come out, or are we going to have the tools we need in 2017? And so some of this climate research that's been conducted, it's not like this is going to just happen tomorrow. We need investments of long-term projects. I was part of a really neat project that was funded by the National Science Foundation called Climark. And this project really looked at tart cherries, which was interesting because we've had some disasters, I think is one, but they also bloom early. So we looked at tart cherries in 5 different countries. It was Poland, the United States, kind of represented by Michigan, Hungary, the Ukraine, and Germany. And we looked at these 5 countries, and so it was quite neat. There was a group of climatologists that had climate predictions for mid-century, late century, and then those climate predictions flowed into a horticultural model. So would we get more or less spring frosts, and we would feed that into the horticultural model? Would we freeze out more or less? And then basically based on your crop yields, that would feed into an ag economist model. And so how would that affect trade? How would that affect different strategies of different countries around the world? Would Poland grow more cherries and we would import more cherries, or how that would work? This was a very complex project, but I think it was really neat in terms of when you bring it back to the grower level. It doesn't matter if you're in Poland or Germany, those are the same issues that these guys are dealing with around the world. And so again, for those of us with boots on the ground dealing with those growers, I feel like sometimes bringing that message, you're not alone. Climate's an issue, SWD is an issue, and bringing that back home to Michigan, I feel like growers feel, oddly reassured sometimes that they're not in this fight alone. And then I think they also feel that there are researchers around the world working on their behalf.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that crises do bring people together. That's, for any kind of crisis, that's true, and it's unfortunate, but I think it's a wake-up call. But you had mentioned something earlier where it's like, we should have been working on this 20 years, and then you go, no, it should have been 30 years. Why? What was the halt? If there was the data and people were noticing this stuff, why wouldn't it be a bigger deal? Like, oh my gosh, well, just in case, let's take care of this so that we can mitigate this issue.
You know what? That is like, I feel like I tried to say that a little bit last night. Sometimes I feel like these conversations are really hard to have. And I feel like a lot of times you don't have to have them until there is a crisis. And so I feel like there's been these climatologists that have been, telling us like, hey, these climate scientists have been telling this for years. And I feel like it's probably been in more of the natural sciences. So let's say I'm an entomologist by training. And I remember hearing about this when I was in grad school, 15 years ago. And so I remember there was a butterfly in Texas. This is just a random remembrance, but it was a butterfly in Texas that had never been seen in these counties in northern Texas. And so as an entomologist, you're like, boy, that is, that's an indicator of obviously something strange is going on, that somehow these butterflies are found in more northerly areas than they've ever been found before. And so as a natural scientist, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. But sometimes I feel like in agricultural science, then you have to say, hey, these things are happening in the natural world. Are they impacting your crops or your food source? And until they do, it's hard to bring that science back home to that farm. Farmers are, for whatever reason, they traditionally have been more conservative. And I think that those conversations are hard to have because if they're listening or talking to other people where science, climate change, it's just a sunspot, or it's just a change, or it's a glitch in the system. Sometimes until it happens to you, it's hard to really understand that. And so I feel like we've been really trying to have these conversations, but I feel like we didn't really have the serious conversations we should have been having until we had 2 crop losses in a row. I mean, I feel like we should have been, boy, are we spraying more for cherry leaf spot? Are we getting more generations of coddling moth and apple? I mean, we might have been seeing these things, but again, is that an anomaly? Is that just a weird year, 2009, or, whatever it is? But until you start to see these things that really hit home, then I think we start having those serious conversations. And I feel like those conversations are still hard today. I mean, I feel like, because it comes from a place of who's to blame. And a lot of times agriculture is at the top of that list. Our growers deal with a barrage of different things, whether it's immigration issues or labor issues or invasive insect pests, or we have new food safety issues. Right now, we have tons of things that these guys they want to farm, and now they're dealing with tons of different regulatory issues. Is this climate change? Is it because of things that they're doing, and are they going to have to change? And so when you start having those tough conversations, are you going to have more regulation on your farm because of these different things? I think those are hard to have. And the other thing is, no one wants to be the blame of all of this. And so sometimes, it's interesting to see the shifts in attitudes. And I feel like our growers have really shifted in their attitudes, recently. And I think they're more willing to talk about it openly. And I think they're willing to embrace. And we did a survey one time after 2012. Would you be willing to let us do climate change related research on your farm? And the percentage was very high. there was a huge percentage, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but there was a lot of growers that said, yes, we want to work with you. We want to, come up with a better understanding of how, we can deal with this on our own farms. And so I feel like those conversations should have started, especially in the ag community, a long time ago, but I think it was hard to get there. And then the other thing is, you want to come from a place of compassion and help, rather than, is this your fault, or pointing the finger. And so I feel like in the ag community, we've really tried to work at our research station and an extension across the country, developing that level of trust. And so you can have those tough conversations when you have that level of trust. But you can't just sweep into somebody's farm and say, oh my gosh, you're gonna have to change because of X, Y, and Z, and well, you're having hailstorms, so you gotta do this. So I feel like you've had to build up that level of trust to have some of these hard conversations.
And it's not only the difficult conversation of that, is that science is difficult to communicate, and that sometimes scientists aren't the best communicators. So there's that disconnect, and then nothing, because they're enveloped in their trade, in what they're doing. And that's also why it's hard for a person who just isn't in science, doing science, that you have to be doing the science and know all this stuff to really grasp it fully. So it's a challenge for the scientists. How do we disseminate all of this difficult information to someone who can ingest it or digest it in a short amount of time, or in a news clip? And in that news clip, you see these two people on each side, as if it's represented, that there's science against this one person, where it should be like 100 people versus one guy.
Exactly. So I was thinking there was two things I wanted to say to that. First of all, I feel like our growers do understand science, because their systems are so complex. I feel like 20 years ago, and I get some of my older farmers, they tell me this, Nikki, this is so hard. I remember I used to just spray this one thing one time a year, and then that was it. And now I'm like, well, you have this to worry about, and this to worry about, and this to worry about, and here's a model, and here's, can you get this on your smartphone? Oh, you don't have a smartphone. So I feel like all these technologies are changing. The complexity of growing fruit is changing. There's all these new things that these guys have to learn. And it's like, how much can they digest? How much can they, really think about? And I feel like our growers are really doing a great job. I think they're good stewards, and they want to do the best that they can for their land, their crops, and their family. And so I think they're embracing science, even though it's hard sometimes. And then I had another point that I was just thinking about too. Something about, science aren't good communicators sometimes. And I feel like that's the role, and that's the other thing. I feel like I look around the country at the institution of extension, of extending information to communities, whether it be 4-H or health and nutrition or, agriculture, that you need to have those people that can distill or take that science and extend it in a way that's not overwhelming, that's not sounding like a bunch of, elitist jargon. It's boiling that down into something that the general public can understand. And so I feel like that's a role, and I feel like that's why Extension's been tremendously successful across all the areas that they work in. Like I said, they're embedded in this community, but they're also translating potentially very complex information into something that growers can really use. And then the other thing that we brought up last night, we don't have a solution. So that's a really, when you have that conversation, boy, I think these things are happening. This model says this model says that, but there's nothing I can really help you with. There's nothing I can do. And so that's the conversation I think that everyone needs to be having. What can you do as a citizen of this planet is one thing, but then when you have a community that's looking to you to say, hey, Nikki, I don't know what to do on my farm this year, or how to manage this or this, I think that is a really hard conversation to have. So you're talking about something that you can't really say, well, here's your problem right here, and here's 6 ways to solve it. We don't have that yet. And I feel like sometimes that makes that conversation really hard.
This is a really hard issue. Even just talking about it proves to be extremely difficult. It's crazy. But I'm hopeful. I think more and more conversations are being had and more information is being spread easier and for free through the internet. It's all so accessible now. And I think it'll only get more and more difficult to hide the truth as we move forward.
Chronicity, a state of prolonged duration, recurrent, habitual, chronic.
A new mini-series on chronic pain and illness by your friends Matt and Phil from Semi-Intellectual Musings.
We go beyond medical diagnosis to explore the often forgotten political, social, and personal sides.
You'll hear stories from extraordinary people overcoming extraordinary challenges.
Authors, entrepreneurs, volunteers, coaches, and caregivers.
They are so much more than their diagnoses, yet each have found ways to persevere.
You'll also hear some familiar voices from the indie podcast community,
showing that art, creativity, and passion are possible while living in chronicity.
These stories and more, starting April 1st at thesim.podbean.com.
Those are the guys from the Semi-Intellectual Musings podcast. I recommend tuning into their show, especially the one on placing bets, because they feature 4 songs off of a new band's debut EP called Playing Basements. That band is called the Band Alexander, and they're from Indianapolis, Indiana. Happens to be where I'm from. It also just happens to be the band that I'm the drummer for. So that was pretty cool to be featured on their podcast. So I thought I'd play their promo on my podcast. Also, I think you should just tune in. I'll make sure to put a link to that show in the notes of that episode on thebeliefbooks.com.
So what can a normal human being in the world do? I have a full-time job or kids, and I get home and I'm tired. What can I do about it?
I mean, I try to think about what I can do as a researcher, as a communicator. First of all, I think we just have to talk about these things, and that's what I really took away from last night. I feel like there was a lot of people that wanted to talk. So in the Q&A, there was no questions. People wanted to tell their story because I don't think we've had a venue to tell their stories. I mean, I thought that there was going to be like, oh, Nikki, so what do growers do about X? I thought there was going to be a lot of that. And it was really about the elder tribesman wanted to say he's been having this, conversation with the members of his community for a long time, but he really felt like he didn't know that there was other people out there. And then this guy said he was in a basement of a bookstore talking about these things. And so I feel like communication is one thing I think that we can do. And this is just so minor, but I'm a pretty big cyclist. So I ride my bike to work every day. And it's funny, like our growers, when I first started doing that, they were like, I don't understand that. You ride on the road, you're in the way of my tractor and my truck, and I got to deliver my cherries. And so I feel like sometimes like these weird examples of things that you do in your life that they probably wouldn't have thought of. They probably were just like, oh, those bikers are hogging the road. I got to deliver my fruit. And they're like, oh, but our research director, our person, she rides her bike to work every day. So I feel like some of those small things, those decisions you make in your day-to-day life, I'm not telling growers they need to ride a bike. I'm not telling them they need to get a fuel-efficient car. I'm not lecturing them. I'm just doing what I would do in my life. And so I feel like that opens up a way to have a conversation. Again, without bringing blame or pointing fingers. It's just like decisions. Both my husband and I drive a Prius. And so I get a lot of, growers are like, oh, that doesn't look like an orchard car. So I get a lot of that on the farm of a little bit of needling and, good camaraderie between, me and the growers. But those are decisions that we made for our family and our life. And I'm still really accepted in the ag community. And again, I'm working on their behalf. And it's that level of trust that, oh, Nikki's a little nuts. She puts on her spandex and rides her bike, 20 miles home. And then, we still can come to that common ground. And that's one thing I don't feel like there's a lot of place in this country right now to find that common ground. And how to do that when you have two opposite sides of, finger pointing, or I'm on this side of the aisle or that side of the aisle. We don't have a place that we can come anymore to find that common ground. And I feel like we've kind of done that here. And for me, it's like, it wasn't easy. I mean, it's taken a long time to develop these relationships, but now you're in the place where you can have those conversations where you may not disagree, but at least you can come to that common ground and have this discussion. And I don't see that happening at the national level. And even the audience last night, I would say that they were probably on one side. And I feel like there were very few of those other people that would have been, well, I'm not really sure about climate change, but I'm going to go to this thing, last night and really hear what these guys have to say. I don't feel like that community or that, for lack of a better word, that side was representative. You heard it from the people in the audience. Oh, we're preaching to the crowd. We already know this. It's like, well, how do we reach those people that may not come to the State Theater to hear this? And I feel like that's, and that's what I said. My statement last night was kind of silly, but sometimes you do have to be brave, and you have to be that voice in a room where there's like, I don't know about climate change, but I do see I've lost my crop in the last few years. How can we mitigate risk? How can we talk about that? And so you can have those conversations. And I feel like, yeah, it's easy to kind of preach to the choir sometimes. And yeah, that's what I just was trying to convey last night. And I don't know if it came out that way, but it's like, it's not easy to ride a bike or drive a Prius in a community that maybe don't embrace those as much as you do in your own personal life. But it doesn't mean that they devalue my information, my passion for what I do any less. I think it's just maybe a way to have even more unique conversations and communications.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tricky. How do you draw people out of their bubble? Or, because it's uncomfortable going, okay, what am I wrong about? Or what could I be wrong about? Let me go to that side of things. I have two questions. I'll take them one at a time. What would be your method of getting people who deny climate change is happening or anywhere on that side? How do you draw them? What are the methods to get them to consider or come to an event or look at information?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I know the answer to that, but I was just thinking about how many growers I know have ever been to the State Theater. Maybe when they were kids, before it was redone. You know what I mean? I feel like that's a place, downtown Traverse City, that there's probably, we have some growers that probably go every, week or whatever to see the movies. But they often don't because they're working, they prune all winter, they're busy all winter doing things, and then in the summer they simply don't have time to take in, a movie or things like that. And if they did, would they go choose that venue even? And so that to me was just like these are a lot of times more rural people. If they went to the movies, they might, go out to the one by the mall. It's easier to get to, it's easier to park. So things like that. So I feel like even the venue was really set up for people that were like, they like to walk, they live downtown, they, that's how they would get there, is riding their bikes. So I feel like even that venue sometimes maybe, they didn't take that to a community. They wanted people to come to, a place smack dab in the middle of kind of like a city. I know Traverse City is not like the hugest city in the world, but it's still like, the parking issue or whatever those reasons are. If you're a rural person, like I work with a guy who goes to Traverse City very rarely. I have people that haven't left the peninsula in a long time. I have growers on the other side that are like, I have to drive to the research station to, so it's just really interesting. So I feel like sometimes maybe finding that right way to communicate in that right venue to communicate, and often going out into those communities, I think is maybe a better way than asking them to come to you. Because I bet you everyone in that audience, or the majority of the people in that audience, have been to that State Theater in the last month. That's my guess. Whether they brought their kids there for spring break because they have 25-cent movies, or they had events like last night. I just feel like those people are kind of regular people that would do that kind of thing. And so they're just people that choose to do different things, and I feel like trying to find a way to communicate maybe more in those communities might be a little bit more effective. And I feel I really liked Lisa's answers and I really liked Jim's answers last night, because I think the way to get to people is through economics, especially like a grower community, the grower community. Growers are very good businessmen and women, very good. And so I feel like when things make sense for their pocketbooks, I feel like that makes sense for them. And so I think that was one thing that I heard last night, that I really like some of the economic information. That would be a different way to communicate. And then the other thing I really was interested in, I'd like to read her book, was the woman that was, her husband was the pastor. It was the clip we saw. I'd never really heard of this woman before. And so I thought that was really unique, because a lot of our growers, they do go to church, and they, again, it's that religion versus science thing sometime. And so I was really interested to maybe read how they're making that happen in their Christian communities. So that was a unique thing that I really had never thought of before.
Yeah, I thought it's interesting that maybe it's not that we have tried to get people to come to us, that we might need to reach out to these people for, taking a little more action into our own hands, wherever it may be.
So I'll tell you a neat thing we did, Josh. We got a grant one time for after 2012, and I think that was a GLESA grant. Well, we got a couple of them, but we had this one. It was quite interesting. We got a grant with some other folks in Extension, and it was simply to have conversations about climate change with members of rural communities. So we did one up north with fruit growers. We did one in the middle of the state with corn, soybean, kind of more traditional ag. And then we did one with regulators, kind of like state agency type folks. And then we did one with agribusiness, people that sell chemicals or fertilizers. And so we did this with these different groups, but I'd never heard of this before. And this was called a fishbowl. So the fishbowl was the people you invited to this meeting sat in the middle, and then all the researchers and all those other folks sat on the outside. And the people on the outside were not allowed to talk at the people inside. So there was a facilitator that was facilitating a conversation about climate change. So if you didn't like climate change, you could say whatever you wanted in this like fishbowl, and then people would react to it. But the scientists or the people the knowledgeable ones, weren't allowed to say, oh, well, that's not correct. We see this. And then after they had talked internally, then the research community or extension community was, they could respond to some of those things. But there was a way, and I feel like that happens, and that's how you get to difficult conversations. It was a unique way to get to difficult conversations. And so those difficult conversations, you couldn't cut somebody off or tell them they were wrong. You couldn't say anything. And so if another grower or whatever in that inner circle wanted to have that dialogue, then that was the people you invited. They could have that dialogue. And so I feel like sometimes in these conversations, you have the experts that aren't listening because they're too busy telling you whether climate change is happening or did you see these data or that kind of thing. And you didn't have that in this weird, it was a unique communication tool that I'd never done before.
It's so cool. During this experience of creating a podcast, I've been meeting so many great people, and from my guests to supporters to other podcasters, and I even have a couple fans. I've been getting really encouraging messages and meeting some interesting people like Bernard, who recently emailed me, and he had this to say. He said, "Hi Josh, I just finished listening to your latest episode with Trevor Spencer, and I wanted to let you know that I really enjoyed it. You are gracious, passionate, and are giving a unique perspective to your podcast. You also do an excellent job asking pertinent questions. I must say that Trevor was a great guest. He was very knowledgeable and had an interesting perspective on his faith. I am looking forward to listening to your other podcasts. My journey started out as a genuine quest for God, but it has taken me to the most unexpected places. I've been getting very positive feedback on my work, and I genuinely believe that over time, it will gain recognition because the evidence is strong. For most of my life, I've considered myself an atheist, or perhaps more accurately, an agnostic. I have no idea how I should classify myself now, but perhaps the closest definition would be that of a Spinozian pantheist, or more accurately, that of a non-dualist. I think the last 15 years spent in close proximity with theologians and believers has brought me to broaden my horizons. Today I dream of atheists and theists embracing a secular, open, and universal form of spirituality that rests on science and that is totally exempt of dogma. I'd love the opportunity to chat with you and tell you a little more about my work. Best regards, Bernard. I appreciate the feedback, Bernard, and thanks for reaching out to me. I'm glad you liked the episode and appreciate the conversation that we've had so far. I should mention that him and I have been emailing back and forth, and he will actually be appearing on the podcast as a guest once I do my next wave of interviews. Right now I have like 10 interviews that I haven't edited yet, and I have 3 more weeks left until I finish my master's degree. So, not making excuses, but I just thought I'd mention it. I've been doing my best to keep up with social media. I'm on Twitter and have connected with a surprising amount of potential guests and other podcasters on there. One of those podcasters, Sam, is from Out of Eden podcast, and he tweeted at me the other day. He said this: listening to my first episode 3 of the Belief Books, and all I keep asking is, why haven't we built these plants years ago? Fascinating interview. Everyone must listen. Josh Naiman, keep up the good work, my friend. Hashtag climate change is real. Hashtag science matters. Hashtag truth seeker. Thanks, Sam. Episode 3 was the episode with Fergus Bauman. If you haven't listened to that, his organization, Climo, supports an amazing new technology that can actually help solve our climate change problem. I'll leave that there. From some tweets and messages, Sam and I actually decided to collaborate, and just the other week he had me on his show as a guest. So I'll share that episode once he posts it. In the meantime, check out Out of Eden podcast. I highly recommend it. So, I can't really tell you how cool it is that I have supporters so early on, and I'm gonna get right to it because it's actually becoming a decent sized list. But I also want to make sure to give a shout out to all of my official supporters. So, to my patron listeners, thank you Greg Naiman, Nana Naiman, and Eric Roche. To my readers, Meltem Yetis, Serdar Yetis, and Berk Yetis. And to my wonderful publishers, Hyundai Naiman, Mark Naiman, Bill Marpom, Nectar Gems, Benjamin C. Stout Photography, Stand Wrap, the Come to the Table podcast, and Scott Severns. Thank you all. If you like what I'm doing too, you can support me for as little as $1 a month on Podbean's Patron program. You can find more information about how that works, what you get, directly on Podbean through the Patron program, or on the support page of thebeliefbooks.com.
So our research is owned by our growers. They lease it out to MSU for $1 a year. We're MSU employees, but the growers, they own the buildings, they own the land, and they invested in this. And so this place is a place that they built and that they trust and that they love. And so again, when you come here and have those conversations, they feel like this is theirs. This is a part of their community. This is a part of their legacy and the agricultural tradition in this area. And so I feel like a lot of times maybe that state theater isn't that place to have those conversations for a lot of these growers, but a place that they trust and know. Maybe this research station, maybe it's, their town hall, wherever that is. I feel like you got to figure out how to start these conversations. But putting up posters in downtown Traverse City where these kind of people people that live in rural communities may not go regularly. They're not gonna, I doubt there was one at our, big local chain grocery store, for instance. There might have been one at our food co-op, but there's not gonna be one where maybe more of these people shop. And so again, like, how do you reach them? How do you, have those conversations? Again, I think you have to find someone that's a trusted member of that community. So we have a difficult conversation right now. We have a bike path in Leelanau County that goes kind of just north of Sutton's Bay, all the way to Traverse City. So it's 17 miles, it's awesome. And it goes through lots of farms. And so they want to put one in from Traverse City up to Charlevoix. And these conversations are they've been hard to have, because it's growers' property, they're going through their lands. And so the people that are building these trails, they said, could you come in, Nikki, and just tell us, why might these guys be nervous about this? Or why is there some hesitation? What they did, their next step, was a bunch of growers that really don't agree with this, invited them to a meeting. And so I haven't heard how it went, but these people that want to build a bike trail went into a grower community to try to sell this bike trail idea to landowners. And so, again, that's another tough conversation. But a lot of those people at the State Theater would be like, well, I don't understand why we wouldn't put a bike path in there. Like, it wouldn't even register with why they wouldn't do that. And so, again, you have this disconnect. Even in a tight-knit community like the Grand Traverse region, there's disconnects there. And so trying to find those people and those linkages to bring these people together to have these tough conversations, I think there's not that many of them out there.
One, before I forget, in the future, when you do hear about that bike trail, I'd like to maybe put at the end, by the way, the bike trail did get made. Hopefully it does. Or, this is what happened to complete that story.
As a cyclist, I want that thing to get made. You know what I mean? I like, I'm also a road cyclist, so I have mixed feelings sometimes about trails, but I do like the idea of trails, in that, I think it's really exciting. But I think, again, I kind of just talk to some of the growers that I work with, and, even some guys that are a little bit, younger, that might have different ideas than their dads or their grandpas, and they're worried about, well, what happens if I accidentally, sprayed a biker? Or what happened if am I going to be liable? So they're just really worried about their farms and their livelihoods. And again, you don't want to be the person in the wrong. We see this all the time. Oh, that's a beautiful Honeycrisp. I just rode 30 miles. I'm going to help myself. This happens a lot. And so these kinds of situations, again, how you have those conversations with people that are hungry on a bike trail. Is it okay to take fruit? And you're like, oh, it's one apple. But if there's 1,000 bikers a day, and so those are things that, again, that biker is going to be like, that's ridiculous. I don't understand what one apple is going to mean. And then you're on the other side where it's like, I worked really hard. This is how I'm going to pay my bills. This is how I'm going to heat my home. This is my work. Like, I wouldn't come into your work and just steal your pencils off your desk. You know what I mean? So you have these really weird ideals. And so how to figure out how to bring those groups together, even to start that conversation, I think, is where we are at this point.
Okay, so someone's watching this and they're like, I don't buy it. Climate change is, I've seen on the news that there's a debate and the science isn't in. What can they do? What would you suggest for them to do to go forth and kind of find the reality, or, find their way wade through this incredible amount of information from both ends?
Josh, I don't know if I can answer that, but I agree. I agree it's a huge issue. And especially, if you're someone that listens to two kinds of talk radio, the publicly funded talk radio versus, other types of talk radio. And so hearing both of those things, that right there is totally, so it's not like, oh, well, go to this trusted news source. Well, in my opinion, that's one trusted news source, but they really believe that this other method of communication or this other way is better. So I feel like that's not a good way. And I feel like sometimes I don't know, because it's could you recommend a book? Or because it's how do you know if that book's true? We get all the time too, oh, Nikki, it's a model. You know what I mean? So I'd like to say, hey, here are data, because I feel like growers believe data. When I show them efficacy trial results and product A works better than product B, growers home will go home and use product A. I showed them the data, but I feel like in climate data are hard to wrap their heads around a little bit because they're models. So what I'd like to do is put models into some kind of real world situation. And so that's what I feel like this Climate project, when we have the data in, I think that growers are going to like this, because what Dr. Winkler's data basically did is come up with these climate projections, and they're different, because that's the other thing. Well, if the EU has this model, the Canadians have this model, the Americans have this model. So everyone's got all these different models. They're all telling them something different. But what we tried to do is pick these models, and then what we tried to boil it down is, how many times are you going to lose your crop in mid-century or late century? So we tried to break it down into real terms. Who are the winners and losers? Let's say this model's wrong. It could be totally wrong. But what we tried to do, Julie tried to do, the climatologists around the world got together and came up with what they thought. It was the European models. We took European and American models, kind of put those together, came up with the climate predictions, and then we tried to translate it into something that really takes that message home. And I feel like that is a way to maybe start that conversation, instead of giving them large conceptual models of climate data, or this guy's right or this guy's wrong. Taking that message and delivering it back to, what does that mean for your planting date if you're a corn grower? What does that mean for your bloom date if you're a tart cherry grower? What does that mean? Because if I look at tart cherries, Jim probably told you this, we're blooming 7 to 10 days earlier than we had, a decade ago. The blade doesn't freeze over like it did 2 decades ago. Those are things I think growers, people that may, and I don't mean all growers don't believe in climate change. Just mean that community that may not believe in climate change. When you take that information and give it into something that makes sense to them, I think that is maybe a way to, again, start that conversation. But that is not going to be done without research and people that are invested in trying to deliver that message. Because I think that having a panel that talks about climate change to the choir is never going to get us boiled down to where we need to go. We need to have these tough conversations. And how do you have them? If radio station A is playing one thing and radio station B is playing the other. And then the other thing is, I feel like there needs to be, and I don't know how to say this in the right way, but the conversation at the national level. I feel like we haven't had real conversations with either administration, with the new administration or the last one, because I feel like the last one might have tried to have some of these conversations, but he had, a Congress that didn't want to have that conversation. And now we have like a situation where we have an administration that has all the people in his camp, so we don't have to have that conversation. So I feel like at the national level, it's like parents setting the example for children. If you don't have a conversation at that national level by our leaders, how can you expect communities or people on different sides of the aisle in your hometown to have those conversations when that example's not been set in a long time? And I always feel like that's leadership to me. Leadership is really having those conversations or facilitating those conversations without interjecting your opinion all the time. And I don't feel like those conversations have been started at this national level all the time. And so you still have those camps that are dividing up, and now we're building walls around these camps. And so it's getting worse and worse. And so I feel like we used to be able to, I remember when I was a kid, my grandfather was an X and my mom was a Y, but those conversations happened at our dinner table. And I feel like, my brother right now has a situation where his in-laws are in a camp and he's in a different camp. And their way to deal with it is not to talk about it. So it happens at kitchen tables, it happens at the national level. And so I feel like we're in a really tough spot. And I feel like we don't really have the time to waste, that we got to start these conversations. Again, I just feel like I wanted to tell this group all of this last night. That's what I wanted to tell this group, that you guys got to figure out a way to start these conversations with people outside this room. And I feel like that is a hell of a lot more difficult than to have the conversations with folks you already know you're on the same team with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we made it into a drinking game, if every time you said conversations, you take a drink. But I think that is what it's all about, is talking about it. My family's the same way. I don't know who voted for who because no one wants to talk about it. Even if I ask, probe, no, we do not talk about it. It's like, why? This is like the most important thing and you're not going to talk about it? Really? Like, why? Just because it's a little hard or you might get your feelings hurt? Disconnect from your ego just a little. A conversation is all we have. This is all we have. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Hopefully the people that were at the event can maybe watch this and hear your elongated version of what you really wanted to say.
Yeah, that's what I feel like. I feel like I was just, and I'm actually so glad that I have this conversation with you today, because I just felt like I left so frustrated. I left frustrated with myself. I left frustrated with my message. I didn't get it across well. I felt like it wasn't heard. I just felt like, oh, she's in agriculture. She probably didn't really feel as impassioned as these other people that had these stump speeches and these statistics ready to roll, because I thought we were going to have more of a conversation. I feel like and this is probably totally just me thinking I did a bad job, so keep that in mind. This is only me feeling down on myself. But it's like, I didn't feel like anyone wanted to engage with me after that, but everyone wanted to engage with Lisa or with Jim. And so they were like, oh, well, Nikki might be on the other side of the fence, or whatever that was. When I left, I was just like, I just feel like we're perpetuating potentially this situation. That's only my opinion, though. And I could have been totally wrong, or they were probably just like, oh, she was just nervous or whatever. I mean, whatever. But that was just how I felt a little bit. But that's why I'm actually really glad that you came back today to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm glad too. I maybe have one more question, and then I'll leave it to you to wrap anything up or leave a last message. I'm watching this. How do I get involved with what you're doing, or maybe an organization that you think they're doing great stuff? How does someone get involved and start doing something?
Well, what I think that the other thing we don't see a lot of is we are being talked at a lot. Whether it's your radio stations, your TV, or whatever, somehow you got to figure out how to get yourself educated, whether you believe side A, side B. But I feel like we got to find out, we're trying to teach our daughter just to ask questions, to be a problem solver. I feel like in America, we're not really problem solving anymore. And so we're just oh, I always listen to this guy, so he told me that. I didn't even bother to explore the other side. And so I feel like maybe figuring out how to educate yourself, and maybe that's having a conversation after church over coffee, or hey, what are you reading, or what do you think about this? Starting those conversations in your hometown, in your community, with your pastor, with your friends, at your dinner parties. I mean, yeah, a glass of wine, let's talk about some of these things. And so I feel like maybe informing or trying to get informed is one thing, because I feel like there's a lot of apathy out there about a lot of different things right now. Whether you voted for X or Y, you're apathetic about this administration or the last administration. So if you're not happy, are you doing anything about it? You know what I mean? So I feel like there's so much apathy out there that we're just not even bothering to get educated or to think about the other side. And we're not even bothered because we're on this team, and my rest of my teammates feel this way. I don't have to leave my team because we know this is right. We don't even question that anymore. I mean, that is our staunch belief. And so I feel like maybe some self-discovery, self-exploration might be warranted. I feel like last night actually really kicked me into thinking again. Nikki, you were really passionate about a lot of different things, but sometimes you get caught up in life. In life, you're raising kids, you're working every day, you're doing all this thing, oh, I don't have time for this, or I don't have time for this, or, maybe it's just easier to watch Netflix. You know what I mean? So maybe it's time that we all have been, at some level, and myself definitely included, that maybe I need to read that book about the woman that, is a Christian that believes in climate change. I probably wouldn't have picked that book up. It's just not something that I would have been oh, I'm going to read that. You know what I mean? So it took me going to the State Theater to see that, to say, hey, so stepping out of your comfort zone, stepping off your team for a minute, stepping into your library or, your different radio station button that you never hit. I see my husband, he does this a lot. He's really good. He reads this magazine all the time, but then he'll listen to this radio station just to hear what's going on. And I'm like, oh, how can you stand that? I can't believe you're doing that. Well, yeah, he wants to know. And I feel like I've been probably too damn comfortable on my team. And so I feel like this conversation between me and you is a way that maybe I just need to think a little bit differently and get a little more active and proactive about what I know and what I don't know and what else is out there. So, I don't know. I feel like this has been a really valuable lesson, for me as a reminder that these are things that we all need to be doing as good citizens of this country and of this planet. We need to be starting these conversations, and you can't do that unless you have at least some idea of what's going on.
Or just even starting it. Even if you don't know what's going on, let's just talk. I think you hit on one thing where the beauty of science, I think the people that I either read or hear talking or talk directly to in the science community or people who value science is that there's something beautiful about being wrong. There's something humbling about realizing, oh my gosh, I was completely wrong. But that's a good thing because that means you're right now. Yeah. Or you're more right now. And I get why people would be afraid of that because it could be shattering to their world. But there's a scientist, Lawrence Krauss, who always says that he believes that it's so important that at some point in everyone's life that something that they thought was 100% true that meant so much, they find out to be wrong. Because that's huge. And that can be that shift that you were talking about, that shift that might just be the spark.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing is, I just heard this brief interview on the radio. He gave this speech. He's a Harvard professor. He gave this speech, and it was about asking questions. So it was a commencement speech, and I can't remember what it was. I wanted to look him up because I want to read this book. And it was like, nobody asks questions anymore. We take your team's information and we just go with it. Or you don't ask it. So he wrote this book and it was called, What? Wait. And he was like, he got it. So he said he was always interested as a kid in questions. Like his dad was like, oh, you're gonna be a lawyer because you have so many questions. I can't, get around these. But then as teenagers, he'd be like, you need to do blah, 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 blah. And then tomorrow you need to clean the room. They'd be like, what? Wait? Wait, what? Like that kind of thing. So then he went through all these questions, and I guess it's gone viral on the internet, this commencement speech, and now he's written a book. But it's like, we don't ask questions. We just take everyone, taking, everything, whatever talking head is talking at us, and we just take that. We don't bother to say, hold on, that doesn't make sense, or, oh, what do you think about that? We don't bother, we just take it, and then we go with it. So I'm really interested. I can't remember his 5 questions, but it was really interesting, because it was like, oh, hold on. Now I'm paying attention to you. Now I'm directing, what are you saying to me? And it was like, his example was real cute because it was like his kids weren't listening, and then they were like, no. What do you mean? And then they'd engage. And so I thought it was really neat. But then he has questions about compassion, about, all these different things that get at all these different feelings. And if you just take things at their face value all the time without being like, wait a minute, why are my trees blooming, 7 days earlier than they were, a decade ago? I may not believe in climate change. I don't at all. But you still got to wonder why that's happening. You know what I mean? And so maybe that's an opportunity to step back from your whatever belief that you have and just maybe think about why. Maybe you have that conversation with the rest of your growers at coffee, when you meet every morning at 7, or have that conversation when you have your IPM updates or whatever. So I think that, maybe just stopping for a moment to ask ourselves, or just to question why things are happening, or, they're happening the way they are. Maybe that's a way of starting that self-discovery process. And the other thing I just feel is everybody's too busy these days for anything. I mean, I actually won't let myself say it anymore. Oh, I'm so busy, because it bugs me so much. But everybody's busy. And it's like, I feel like we're in a society where we don't have time to like sit down and self-reflect. We don't have time to ask ourselves or our colleagues or our friends or husbands or kids questions because I got to get to soccer, or I got to get this grant in, or I got to, do whatever you have to do. And so we've got this society that's just like cooking along at like super, super fast that maybe we haven't built that time in. I have a colleague that on campus, he's a plant pathologist and we do a lot of work together. And he took like a 6-week stint and he went to England to do a research project with somebody over there. And he was like, Nikki, you know what they do every day? And I was like, no, George, what do they do? He's like, they have tea and they talk and they think and they like have conversations. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like English. He's like, when's the last time you've actually sat with your staff or, whoever that is in a work setting and actually sat, had a cup of tea, and really be like, oh, how are things going? How's your wife? Oh my gosh, your kid's t-ball team is really good this year. Oh, I got these results on my last experiment. Like a time to just sit down and engage with your colleagues and think. And that's what I feel like is my biggest fault in this job. And I have a lot of faults. I'm not trying to say I don't. I feel like I don't take the time to think, how can I help this industry? How can I help my growers? I'm so busy putting out this fire, responding to this, doing whatever you need to do every day that I'd love to sit and think, what research project really do we need to be addressing next? Where does this research need to be going? How do I have this research station here for the next 50 years? Am I putting these things in place? Am I putting the research in place? Am I building a staff that's gonna, are we gonna prosper? Thinking scientifically, thinking critically, reflecting, all those things take time. And we don't have time in our society anymore. And then how do you explain to your administrator, your boss, well, I just took an afternoon to do some thinking. Well, Nikki, this report's due and this is due. And then, they probably think the same thing. Well, they have a boss, they have this to do, they're depending on you. So it's a self-perpetuating problem that I think that we have. So it's, we can tell people to reflect or self-reflect or ask questions, but if you don't give them the time or it's okay to say, I'm going home because my kid's sick today. But I'm going to tell my staff, I'm going to go home and just think today. Think about what, Nikki? Think about, you know what I mean? What are you going to, it's just not socially acceptable a lot of times to just be like, I'm going to go home and do some self-reflection. Well, should you have got up at 5 a.m. and done it before you got here? You know what I mean? I feel like we don't build in that time, or it's okay if you go home because, your daughter has the flu. But what's different about that I'm going to go home and really think where I need this industry to be going in the next 50 years. It's a strange thing to me.
Yeah, I agree. My wife and I, we've for the past almost 2 months now, we downloaded an app called Headspace.
My husband's a big Headspacer.
Yeah, and it's just 15 minutes, 10 minutes even, but it's really made a difference. Even that, because like you said, it's just boom, 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 all day. Even when you get home from work, it's like, okay, what am I going to ingest next? News and this show. Oh, and I have this show that I need to catch up on from last week. It's like, just take a moment. Just be, and that's, exactly. I think that should be part of the job. I can't agree with you more that in future roles, maybe if I'm managing people or whatever, I'm going to take that into absolute account, that your mental health is just as important as getting that memo done or the TPS report or whatever report, or, because you actually might be more efficient working on those things when you come back clear-headed or just when you have a breath.
Really mean it when you tell your students, your staff. I feel like there's a lot of lip service. Oh, well, Nikki, if you're not mentally healthy, you're not going to help the industry. Or Nikki, you need to take that time with your family. Well, really mean it then. You know what I mean? I feel like there's a lot of lip service out there. And it's like, you really got to mean that. If you truly want your staff or your kids or whoever that is to be mentally healthy, you got to really give them the opportunity to do that. And so, a thing that's been really good for me is to have a kid. Because I had to work myself to death. You know what I mean? Because there's always one more thing to do. There's always one more phone call to make or an email to answer or a grant to write. But I feel like having a kid as an older parent has been the best thing that's happened to me. Because it's like, whew, you just need to chill. We just got to play some hi-ho cherry-o. You know what I mean? It's those things that, you know what I mean? But that for me is a good reason, but I should be able to find that on my own. You know what I mean? You should be able to find that on your own to you have a kid that's like, okay, I'm off work. I'm just being with you. But you, I feel like it's hard to do that. I mean, I watch a lot of my colleagues that can't do it, and I can't do it. I can go home for Sadie, but I couldn't go home just for me. So it's an interesting thing that I feel like it's a societal issue that I hope we figure this out. I want to have tea with you and talk about your life or your research results over a nice cup of tea and a digestif, man. And so I just figure I don't lead by example. I don't even take lunch with my staff. I mean, that's just a shame. So these are things that, I think about. And I know we started at climate change, but I mean, this is where you end up. I mean, these are how do you start that conversation about something so damn hard if you can't even take 10 minutes to clear your head or 5 minutes to do the crossword with your staff at lunch? So I feel like we got a lot of issues, I think, in society that we got to clean up and fix and think about. And I think we all have to be proactive about that before we can tackle climate change or bike trails or whatever the next big things on the horizon are. And if you can't talk about them, then we're just sunk. So those are just some of my thoughts.
They're great. Yeah, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks.
And I think also reminding ourselves about this kind of stuff. I think that the way that this trajectory of conversation goes really digs down to the actual problem. It's not climate change and the conversation about climate change. It actually is deeper. It's rooted deeper than that on the self-reflection and being more critical and taking some time. And I think these things perpetuate too then the rest of our world.
It becomes a hell of a lot easier to just sit in your camp than to take risks. It's even risky to take time to self-reflect. Because what if you're just you know what? I'm not super happy with what I see or where I am right now. So that means you have to make some changes, and that's hard. So if you're not willing to do that yourself, there's no way you're gonna be willing to do that over, a staunch person that believes totally different than you. So, I don't know. I just feel like we have a long way to go, but I feel like this conversation between us has been, it's been invigorating for me. It's been enlightening. And I also think it's been it's just been a way to have a voice about tough things to talk about.
Yeah. Well, thanks for meeting with me again. I
thanks,
really
Jake.
appreciate it. Yeah, it's good to meet you.
Yeah,
Thanks
it was
again.
great.
You're making me tear up.
So, thanks for listening to episode 6 of The Belief Books. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you to Nikki for coming on the podcast, or I guess I came to your office, and then you came on the podcast, and having this really nice and not so difficult conversation with me. If you liked this conversation, you could leave a review on iTunes if you want, or connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and now on Instagram, or directly on my website where you can listen to more episodes and more conversations. You can also find me on the Theology Corner network, which is a network of theological-themed blogs and podcasts. I'm on there with over 40 other contributors, digging into our beliefs, asking the more difficult questions, having the interesting conversations. Check out my page on there, theologycorner.net/thebeliefbooks. You can find me just about anywhere by searching The Belief Books. I also just recently launched the official forums for The Belief Books called The Belief Forum. Just request to join on Facebook or send me your email, and I can invite you. The Belief Forum is a closed group where I created a space so we could have deeper discussions about conversations on the podcast or any other topic you want to explore with the group more. No matter where you find me, or if you find me, just keep the conversation going. So earlier in the episode, I mentioned that I drum for the band Alexander, and on our new EP, we have a song, and it's called The Things We Never Say. And I thought that song would just be perfectly appropriate to play at the end of this episode about conversations and the things that we probably should say more. Now, the context to our song is a little different, but you could apply it to different places. Anyways, I hope you enjoy that, and a shout out to my bandmates Luke Bell, Eric Roche, and Chris Dieter. I'll see you on the next episode of The Belief Books.
Maybe it's not anyone's fault. Maybe we're both in the wrong. Maybe the fire finally burned out. Maybe we watched it go. Maybe you already know, but I'll say it anyway. We became everything we hate, darling. We became strangers. We became things we never say. We lost more than patience. We became everything we ain't, darling. All these years have changed us. We became the things we never say. We lost more than patience. What happened to the passion we had last year? When we were wild with abandon and love without fear. I remember the days our love was enough for the both of us, when my lover and my best friend were the same person. But then we became everything we hate, darling. We became strangers. We became the things we never say. We lost more than patience. We became everything we ain't, darling. All these years have changed us. We became the things we never say. We lost more than patience. We lost more than patience. I'm feeling so old, you're feeling so cold, and you seem so far away. I'm feeling so old, you're feeling so cold, and you seem so far away. I'm feeling so old, you're feeling so cold, and you seem so far away. I'm feeling so old, you're feeling so cold, and you seem so far away. We became everything we hate, darling. We became strangers. We became the things we never say. We lost more than patience. We became everything we ain't, darling. All these years have changed us. We became the things we never
Hot damn. That was a great conversation.